Next we have Bill Arnold. He is a fellow and a head of climate action at the Institution of Structural Engineers and is both a short-dressed structural engineer and environmentalist. He is well known for his work on embodied carbon policy in the UK, including on Part C, and the UK net zero carbon building standard. Will talk to us about leadership on dying planet. Welcome.
A nice uplifting topic to finish the day on. When my mate Clara was 16 years old, she and a friend from her school dressed each other up head to toe in plastic bags and went and stood in the middle of their local town in the middle of the British winter. The plastic bags were pretty uncomfortable. The wind came through, the rain was cold, but they'd set themselves a mission for the day. They'd called their mission, Ban the Bag. It's pretty catchy. They each had in their hand a petition, and on it, this was a petition to try and get support for the idea that the UK should ban the use of single-use plastic bags. Within 2 hours, they'd amassed more than 1,000 signatures, and they promptly went on their way and presented these signatures to the local councillors. What do you think happened next? Nothing. The council did not ban the bag. It was actually 7 more years before this country introduced even a levy on single-use plastic bags. So in this story, who do you think showed more leadership? Was it the elected officials put in charge of the country? Was it the people who meant to be looking after the environment? Was it the local councillors? Or was it the 2 schoolgirls who had dressed themselves up in Sainsbury's bags? About a decade later, the same person, Clara, was working here in London as a building services engineer. And she had come across a loophole in London's planning requirements that allowed you to use gas in order to provide electricity to your building in a way that seemingly reduced the carbon footprint of that building, but actually increased it in the longer term. Now, Clara knew that this was a problem, but she had no idea what to do about it. She didn't have the technical expertise, she wasn't a planner, she didn't know any planners, and she didn't have the sort of influence that some of you people might have, where you could pick up the phone and try and make things happen. But she didn't let this stop her. So she picked up the phone, worked out who in the Greater London Authority to speak to. She got passed on again and again and again until eventually she managed to get through to somebody in the planning department, and she said, look, there's this issue, I have no idea what the solution is, but I think you'll agree with me that we need to find one. Could I run a workshop for you? And the planning person said, yeah, sure, why not? You're not going to charge us for it, right? She went, no, it's free. And she went off to her boss and said, look, I've agreed to put on this workshop and I've agreed we won't charge them for it. Could I have a room, please, a meeting room, maybe some coffee? And her boss said, yeah, sure. He even agreed he'd come along to sort of boost the numbers, slightly naively underestimating what Clara could pull off. When she came back to him and said 120 people would like to come to this meeting, he nearly fell off his chair, and then he worked out how they could get hold of a bigger room, and he thought, well, we better make our company look good, and he managed to convince one of the principals to give the closing talk at the end of the workshop. And the workshop was a big success. These were all sort of volunteer specialists from across London, across the built environment, who understood where you should and shouldn't use things like gas in a building, and they understood some of the other loopholes and some of the other issues with planning in London and in the UK, and they were working on solutions to these. Fast forward to today, and that group of people still meets, albeit in a sort of evolved form. And they're now quite well known in this country for people who work in sustainability and the built environment. They go under the name LETI. LETI is still run by volunteers. It's still people giving up their evenings, working in their weekends, but they've produced some of the most groundbreaking guidance and research that this industry has seen in this space, maybe ever. And they all do so because they want to see the industry change. They want to see it get better. They don't do it for reputation, and this group has never been about themselves. It's always been about helping the industry to evolve. And because of this, earlier this year, their founder, Clara, the same person who dressed herself up in plastic bags about 17 years ago, was given an MBE in the King's Birthday Honours. And the citation says something different, but it was effectively given to her for showing leadership and being able to lead a group of people like this to do what they do best to try and change the industry. I think some people think of leaders as the one who sort of, has the visionary ideas, maybe holds the pen, does the talking, stands on stage for the longest, so on and so forth. Clara's kind of none of those things. Some of you might also think that there's got to be a difference between design leadership and climate leadership, but they're both forms of leadership. So what can we learn from groups like this and people like this? My contention is that there are two aspects to a leader that we could aspire to be more like. A leader must act, and a leader must work to help others to thrive. So if we take Clara as an example of this, when she, to her, she saw the world in black and white, right? Obviously, plastic bags are a bit of a silly idea once you understand how they're made and the fact they last forever. We just shouldn't have them. Obviously, this loophole in planning needed closing. She was surrounded by people who insisted that the world was more grey than this. People who wanted to say, yes, but what if? Isn't this going to cost us money? Hasn't somebody tried it before? Surely we would have done it by now if it was obvious. Barrier, barrier, barrier. She just sort of shunned that and got on with it and acted. And when she acted, it was never about herself, right? It was always about enabling other people to do their job well. Going back to the idea of a conductor, enabling the people around them to play their instruments well. This is what Letty was always about. This is what her work was always about. And I think we can learn from that. So, action and helping others to thrive. And I want to share a couple of examples from my bit of the industry where I've seen this work quite successfully. The first, of course, is from the institution that I work for. And I want to talk briefly about the awards that we give out every year for projects. So to win a so-called structural award, which is what they're called because it kind of does what it says on the tin, to win a structural award is a career highlight for structural engineers. It means that your project is ranked up there with the Sydney Opera House, the Burj Khalifa, the London Eye, as having engineering greatness behind it. But in 2022, we started to ask at the institution, what does greatness actually mean in structural engineering? Is it to do with scale, span, size, magnitude? Is it to do with complexity, difficulty? Is it something to do with craft and beauty in the way we make our structures? Or are those just inputs? Are those just constraints that we have to work with? Actually, is it more to do with the outcome of what we end up designing and deciding upon? So in the end, we completely rewrote our approach to giving out these structural awards, and we formed it around these 4 attributes. And now when projects are entered every year, we judge those projects on their own merit. It doesn't matter whether they fit into a category about being tall or long or whatever. What matters is what they have done to the world as a result. And that's all that really matters with our buildings, right? It's what's the impact at the end of the day? What's the impact on people? What's the impact on the planet? Has this somehow impacted the process that we take for granted around design and construction for the better? And how has it impacted on the profession? An example of this, one of my favourite examples, because if you walk past it, you might not have guessed that we gave it an award, is this building. This is called Holborn Gardens. It's here in the middle of London. And it's, to many, it just appears like quite a modest building. What's special about it is twofold. The first thing is that the top story, which was the only new bit of the building, the rest of it's a refurbishment, the top story is framed out with reused or reclaimed steel beams. So not recycled ones, not steel that's been melted, turned into new steel, reclaimed. So these are beams that have been cut out of a building, taken away, cleaned up, recertified, and built using. Now, it was only about 25 tons worth of this stuff, so it's not, a groundbreaking amount. It would have saved 50 tons of carbon. Very noble, very good, and at the time, nobody had done it quite at this scale. But this is not why we gave the project team an award. We gave them an award because, a bit like Clara, they saw the world in black and white, and they were looking at our industry and saying, this industry has to transition to a circular economy. There is no other way about it. It's not a matter of if, it's when, and the sooner the better, because this is a crisis, this is a sixth mass extinction, and we do need to act. So they acted, and when they acted, they did not in the service of themselves, but in the service of the wider industry. This project for them was never about their IP and about their reputation. It was about the industry's IP and the industry's reputation. And I think we'd agree that there is scrutiny on this industry's reputation right now in lots of different ways. So everything the engineers on this, Hain Tillett Steel, everything they did, they then passed on to their competitors, to their collaborators across the industry. Everything they learned about reusing steel, they wrote up, They put it in guidance, they put it in presentations, they made tools, and they put it all on the internet so that their competitors could then do a bigger and better version next time, because they knew that that was the sort of action that needed to be taken if this industry is going to move forward towards a circular economy at anywhere near the pace that's required. My second example is quite relevant to today, because you'll notice some of your colleagues are listed on the screen behind me. I remember at the start of this, speaking to Paul, wherever he's sat right now, and we were talking about the sort of perceived complexity behind concrete decarbonisation. If you go on Google and you search decarbonising concrete, you could be forgiven for assuming that there's 1,000 different technologies out there, all of which you could pour into the ground tomorrow, if only you're willing to pay somebody enough of your hard-earned money to do so. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that each one's unique and special and better than all the others, because of course that's what the websites say. And what we were interested in was trying to help engineers understand what the differences are between these, trying to help them demystify this sort of plethora of noise that was out there. So we did some research, mostly, I've got to say, led by Paul and Tom, and not that much to do with me. I was more the guy who just said, keep simplifying it, keep simplifying it. Did some research, pulled together the data on what these different techs were, how much they could decarbonise, why, how they were made, so on and so forth, and we put them on the internet for everyone to use. Now that information and that bit of work could have just been done within Ramboll, without my involvement, and held within the Ramboll vault somewhere in the hope of increasing your IP or something in the future. And I know that some of your competitors out there have done exactly that. I've been told, oh yeah, we've got a version of that and we've had it for 3 years. And they don't want to share it for some reason. But the understanding that we had was that actually if you want to see concrete decarbonised quickly, and we're going to be out of a job if it doesn't, let's be clear, then we need stuff like this, because we need the whole industry to understand what technology is at what stage, what is it we should try and get into the ground now, what do we need to maybe wait another 5 years for, and so on and so forth. So this sort of demystifying helps if it's shared across the industry rather than kept in a vault. Last example. So this is an example that's quite close to my heart. This is the end of what's running up to being a 3-year project now, to try and write a standard for this country that explains what a building must achieve if it is to align itself with the UK's net zero laws. So we have a dwindling carbon budget in this country, and it goes down year on year, and we overspend most of the time. How do you design buildings that are aligned with that? And this was published on Tuesday. If you've not come across this before, please do sort of Google it on the internet afterwards. It'll definitely be at the top of the list when you look for it. And this sets out carbon limits, renewable energy targets, accounting methodologies, transparency requirements, so on and so forth. I'm proud of it because of what it does, obviously. This enables a client to say, I want my building to be net zero in accordance with this standard, instead of having to make up what we mean by that every time. But I'm also proud of it because this is the biggest collaborative project I've ever worked on in my life. This had more than 400 people feeding into it. You won't be surprised to hear that Plastic Bag Shunning Clara was involved from the start. And it's never been about one firm, right? This is not the iStruct standard. You know, UK GBC never said it's got to be the UK GBC standard. It was always going to be written by the industry for the industry, and it's much, much stronger as a result. And if there's one bit of sort of climate leadership you could do when you go back to work on Monday, it would be to get hold of this and persuade your client to try and let you design the building to it, because it's quite ambitious, if I'm honest. So my final parting thought, if I've still got 1 minute to speak, would be this. I've talked about action, and I've talked about this idea of helping others to thrive and others to improve, even if it's your so-called competitors. But the final question is always about why we do this, right? Why do you have the job you have? And why do we build the buildings that we build? Because I think that there's a lot of stuff being built out there that we know isn't needed in the same way that certain other things are needed. And we all have our own views on what that means, and I'm sure that we could disagree for hours down the pub about it. But there'll be certain things out there that should not be being built, and we know they shouldn't be. And we know that still to build them is still a drain on our carbon budget, it still damages biodiversity around the world, and yet we go and do it anyway. So my final, I guess, thought with this is one about project selection, but more than that, it's about understanding the influence that we have as leaders to influence other people. Because if you're all here because you are leaders of this firm, right? And so we need to understand that when we decide to do a project or not do a project, that will influence what your competitors do. I often hear when I talk about projects that aren't needed, I hear people say, yes, but if we didn't design it, somebody else would, and we can do a better job. But we all know that statistic about 80% of drivers, right? 80% of drivers think that they're better than the average. And we're all engineers, we understand the number, of course, is 50. Is it just possible that 80% of all engineers think that they're better than average, think that they're better at designing low-carbon buildings? Maybe. So my call to you would be to not just act to help others to thrive, but to do so driven not just by sort of ego, ambition, profit, the ability to try and do the biggest and best new thing, but maybe driven by ethics and humanity and care. Thank you.